The old folks in Rowan Hollow still say the woods can talk, though most repeat it as a joke, pretending they don't notice the way the trees listen back. But every so often, someone goes missing out there, and the laughter dries up. No one jokes after dark in these mountains, not since the winter of 1884, when Elias Turner vanished and the forest began whispering his name in 3 distinct voices. Back then, people still remembered the Brewer brothers, Cale and Jonah, wild-eyed mountain men who grew stranger with every passing year. Some said the wilderness changed them, carved something feral into their bones. Others whispered a worse rumor, that they had taken their sister, Mercy, deep into the timber and bound her fate with theirs, swearing off the world to build something of their own. A family. A belief. A cult. But most dismissed those stories as backwoods gossip, the sort of tale folks invent when the night grows long and the coyotes won't stop howling. Then the carved tokens began appearing on tree trunks, triangles of wood with 3 interwoven shapes etched into them, always hung at eye level, always facing town. No one dared touch them. No one dared admit they'd seen them before, though everyone had. Some claimed the symbols were warnings. Others thought they were invitations. Elias was the first to follow them. When he failed to return, men gathered with lanterns and rifles, pushing into the darkness in tight clusters. But the deeper they went, the more wrong the forest felt. The air vibrated with an eerie hum, low at first, then rising like a chant. No one could agree on where it came from, it seemed to leak from the soil itself. At one point, a searcher shouted Elias's name, and 3 voices answered at once, overlapping perfectly, echoing through the trees though no one stood nearby. After that, half the men fled, refusing to step beyond their own porches again. The rest pressed on, driven by duty or fear or something they refused to name. And somewhere far behind them, deep in the blackened ribs of the mountain, a woman's voice rose, thin, trembling, and unmistakably human, calling for help. No one could tell if it was Mercy Brewer, or something wearing her voice. The forest has kept the truth swallowed ever since, tucked away in its cold, breathing hush. But when the wind turns wrong and the shadows move where they shouldn't, some swear they still hear them, the brothers, the sister, the cult they were said to found, whispering in perfect unison from somewhere just beyond the last line of trees. And the voices never sound quite human. The disappearance of Elias Turner in the winter of 1884 became the first thread in a mystery that would unravel Rowan Hollow for generations, not because he was the first person to vanish in the Appalachian woods, but because of the strange details surrounding his final day. Elias had been a familiar sight in town, a young hunter with an easy smile and a habit of wandering deeper into the forest than most dared. He was experienced enough to navigate ravines, thickets, and old logging trails without fear, but he was also superstitious in quiet ways. He listened when elders warned about the deeper timber and the places where the woods grew too still. He carried charms carved by his grandmother and never traveled alone when winter set in. But on that final morning, something drew him out by himself, something strong enough that he didn't tell a soul where he was going. Tracks later showed he walked with purpose, not the meandering steps of someone scouting or hunting. Witnesses claimed he had seemed distracted the night before, glancing repeatedly toward the tree line as if hearing something no one else could. A neighbor reported seeing him at dawn, pausing at the edge of the woods, head tilted as though listening. He stepped forward slowly, the way a man might approach a familiar friend calling his name. And then he vanished between the pines. The first search party went out within hours, expecting to find him injured or trapped, but the woods offered almost nothing. His footprints led straight for a mile, then stopped abruptly in a clearing dusted with snow. No sign of struggle, no blood, no fallen branches or disturbed brush. The men spread into a wider formation, calling for him until their voices cracked in the freezing air. As evening approached, several searchers independently reported hearing something unsettling, their own voices echoing back to them in a strange, layered harmony. When one man shouted Elias's name, 3 tones responded, perfectly blended, impossible to trace to any direction. None of them wanted to admit it at first, but later each confessed it had sounded eerily close, as if spoken just over their shoulders. By the second day, fear outweighed determination. Men whispered about the old stories, the ones involving the Brewer brothers and their sister, the ones people pretended not to believe. The forest grew heavier, darker, and more oppressive with each hour. Some men refused to return after sundown, claiming they saw lantern lights drifting in synchronized patterns between the trees. Others insisted that the woods felt alive, as though watching them with an intelligence they couldn't name. Elias Turner had simply vanished, but the silence he left behind felt deliberate, as if the mountain had chosen to swallow him whole, and whatever answered the searcher's calls was not interested in letting him go. Whispers of a hidden settlement began circulating long before Elias Turner disappeared, but his vanishing breathed new life into those old tales, pulling them from the fringe of fireside gossip into something colder and more believable. For decades, the Brewer brothers, Cale and Jonah, had been figures wrapped in unease. As boys, they were quiet but watchful, always sticking together, rarely speaking unless spoken to. Their sister, Mercy, was the opposite, gentle, timid, and often seen trailing behind them like a thin ghost unsure of her place. When their parents died unexpectedly, the three withdrew from the world all at once. No funeral, no sale of the farm, no goodbyes. They simply packed what they could carry and walked into the mountains one night, lanterns in hand, leaving behind an empty cabin and a feeling in town like a room suddenly gone cold. What happened after they vanished into the timber became the foundation for whispered speculation. Some said the brothers had turned wild, believing the mountains spoke to them through wind and stone. Others claimed they had grown suspicious of outsiders and wanted to form a closed circle of their own making. The darkest rumor suggested the siblings had created a bond that defied the natural order, that the brothers had crowned Mercy not as a sister but as a prophetic figure, a symbolic matriarch of a twisted belief they'd been nurturing for years. Townsfolk spoke of this quietly, careful never to say it outright, framing it as folklore rather than fact. No one wanted to acknowledge that something like that could breed within their own community. Hunters who ventured deeper into the hills sometimes returned pale and shaking, muttering that they saw smoke from a chimney far beyond the old trapping routes. Others described strange wooden structures, lean-to huts, open circles of stacked stone, and tall crosses made of intertwined branches. One man swore he found a clearing lined with animal bones arranged in spirals pointing toward a trail that shouldn't have existed. Yet when he tried to return with others, he couldn't relocate it, as if the forest had swallowed the evidence back into its belly. The idea of a hidden settlement grew stronger when people started finding footprints in trios, two large, heavy steps followed by one smaller stride, always walking perfectly aligned, as though the three figures moved together with practiced precision. These tracks were discovered miles from anywhere a normal family could survive through winter, suggesting someone, or several someones, had carved out a life where no sane person would. Whether this settlement was real or nothing more than mountain myth, the thought of three siblings isolated enough to create their own rules, their own rituals, and possibly their own followers haunted Rowan Hollow long before anyone dared to investigate. The discovery of the strange wooden tokens marked the moment when rumor began hardening into something physical, something people could touch even though none dared to. The first token was found by a trapper named Willis Crane, a man who had spent most of his life in the mountains and who prided himself on being unshakable. He noticed it while checking his fox traps, a small triangle of wood suspended from a branch with thin strips of bark. At first glance it looked like a child's carving, but the closer he came, the more wrong it felt. The wood was smooth as bone, sanded with unnatural precision, and etched into its center was a symbol of three interlocking shapes, each looping into the next like a knot with no beginning or end. Willis didn't touch it. He backed away slowly and told himself it was just mountain mischief, though his voice trembled when he described it to others later that night. Within a week, more tokens were found, always hanging at eye level, always positioned to face whoever approached. Hunters found them along game trails, woodcutters spotted them nailed into tree trunks at the perimeter of their work sites, and one group of teenagers claimed they saw dozens strung together deeper in the timber, swaying even though the wind was still. No two tokens were identical, yet all shared the same central symbol, as if carved by hands that knew the pattern by memory rather than sight. Some were charred around the edges, others smeared with a reddish clay that looked suspiciously like dried blood at first glance. People began whispering that these carvings were messages, warnings, perhaps, or boundaries marking territory that shouldn't be crossed. An old-timer named Bartholomew Pike insisted the tokens were a sign of the Brewer siblings, that they marked the borders of their new domain. He recalled seeing similar carvings decades earlier, when Cale and Jonah were still boys playing in the woods, carving little shapes into tree bark while Mercy watched silently. At the time, no one thought much of it. Children carved all sorts of things. But these new symbols were far more elaborate, their symmetry unsettling in a way that felt almost ritualistic. Bartholomew swore the tokens were guides, signaling paths that led toward something hidden, paths the siblings wanted followed only by those who understood their meaning. As the tokens multiplied, the forest took on a charged atmosphere. Even those who hadn't seen the symbols felt a shift, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Dogs refused to approach areas where the tokens hung, hackles rising and low growls rumbling in their throats. Birds avoided the branches where they were tied. And every night, people swore they heard tapping from the woods, like someone carving more tokens in the dark, preparing the next message for whoever dared venture too far. The night of the flickering lights became the moment when even the most skeptical residents of Rowan Hollow stopped scoffing at the old stories. It began innocently, with a few folks reporting strange glows between the pines at dusk, lights that looked like lanterns carried by night hunters or travelers who'd lost track of time. But the accounts grew stranger as the nights passed. The lights didn't sway naturally the way lanterns should. They moved with perfect steadiness, gliding in straight lines rather than bobbing with the uneven steps of human feet. Some drifted low to the forest floor, others floated impossibly high, weaving through branches without causing them to rustle. They appeared in clusters of 3, always 3, moving in synchronized patterns like dancers following a silent rhythm only they could hear. On the third night, a woodcutter named Aaron Lively stood on his porch with his wife when he saw the lights again. They emerged from the tree line in a triangular formation, bright enough to cast long shadows across the snow. Aaron thought they were trespassers, maybe smugglers or log thieves, so he called out to them, but the lights did not pause or turn. Instead, they shifted shape, aligning into a vertical column that rose and fell as if bowing. His wife whispered that it looked like a greeting. Aaron said it felt more like a warning. Then the lights separated and slipped back into the woods in 3 different directions, moving faster than any human could through that terrain. Others witnessed similar events. A pair of teenage brothers claimed they saw the light circling one of the wooden tokens before spiraling upward and vanishing into the canopy. A widow living near the creek insisted the lights approached her house and lingered outside her window long enough for her to see their centers. She swore there were no flames, no wicks, no reflections, just orbs of pale, pulsating light with shadows inside them, shifting as though something moved within. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the Brewer brothers had built makeshift lanterns powered by unknown methods, using them to signal followers of their rumored cult deeper in the mountains. Others whispered that the lights weren't lanterns at all but signs of a ritual, a calling, a lure for those the siblings wanted to draw in. A few older residents muttered about mountain spirits, entities that guarded the wild places and didn't appreciate trespass. What unsettled people the most wasn't the appearance of the lights but the silence that accompanied them. Not a single cricket chirped, not a branch snapped, not even the wind stirred when the lights passed through the trees. It was as if the forest itself was holding still, watching alongside everyone else, waiting to see who would be brave, or foolish, enough to follow those flickering lights into the dark woods where the Brewer siblings were said to dwell. The sisters' return began with a scream northwest one could quite place. It echoed across Rowan Hollow at dusk, rolling off the mountains like thunder, thin and panicked but unmistakably human. People stepped out onto porches, shading their eyes against the fading light, searching for the source. At first, the road was empty, but as the sun dipped lower, a lone figure appeared at the far end where the woods pressed close to the town. She moved slowly, almost drifting, her white dress stained with dirt and torn at the hem. Barefoot, hair tangled and long enough to brush her elbows, she walked with the fragile hesitation of someone who had been away from people for far too many years. No one approached her until the light hit her face, revealing the sharp, familiar features of Mercy Brewer, the woman who had vanished with her brothers without a word. Her return should have brought relief, but the moment she lifted her head, the air shifted with a collective shiver. Mercy's eyes were glassy, unfocused, flickering toward the shadows as if expecting something to emerge behind her. When a few townsfolk finally mustered the courage to speak to her, she didn't respond at first. Her lips barely moved, trembling like she was fighting to form words. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the evening breeze, she whispered that they needed to stay away from the woods, that the voices there were no longer human, that they spoke in harmony without mouths, that they watched from beneath the ground and above the treetops all at once. Her warnings made little sense, yet every sentence chilled those who heard it. She flinched at sudden movements, stepping backward each time someone reached toward her as if expecting to be dragged away. Some noticed faint marks around her wrists, darkened by grime, though she pulled her sleeves down whenever she realized they were being observed. When asked about her brothers, she froze entirely, eyes widening with a fear so pure and immediate that several people stepped back instinctively. Her only answer was a broken murmur, "They don't sleep anymore. They don't blink. They listen all the time." That night, Mercy disappeared as mysteriously as she had arrived. She had been given a blanket and a place to rest inside the church, but by morning the door was ajar and the blanket was folded neatly on the pew. Outside, her footprints led toward the woods, stopping abruptly at the tree line the same way Elias Turner's had. No one saw her leave, and no one heard a sound. Some believed she had been taken back, reclaimed by the brothers or whatever she believed followed them. Others thought she had returned willingly, driven by some unseen force or vow she couldn't break. What troubled people most was the question she left behind: if she escaped once, however briefly, what had driven her back into the very darkness she had warned everyone else to avoid? The map found in Elias Turner's cabin became the clearest sign that his disappearance had not been an accident or a simple case of getting lost. It was discovered by his uncle, a quiet, cautious man who entered the cabin only after the sheriff declared the search suspended. Elias's belongings were mostly as he had left them: boots by the door, rifle propped near the bed, a half-whittled piece of pine on the table. But tucked beneath a pile of old newspapers was a water-stained notebook, its edges curled from exposure to moisture or heat. Several pages were blank, scratched over, or torn out, but near the middle of the notebook lay a series of crude sketches that stopped his uncle's breath. They appeared to be maps, rough, hand-drawn outlines of the woods north of Rowan Hollow, but marked with symbols and landmarks no ordinary hunter would chart. Jagged X's dotted the ridgelines, spirals marked several hollows, and a long, crooked line labeled the Calling Pit stretched deep into an area few had ever dared to explore. At first glance, the drawings seemed careless, but the more his uncle studied them, the more intentional they appeared. The trees were marked not as landscape features but as if they were arranged in patterns, almost like constellations. One page showed a ring of stones drawn with uncanny precision, another displayed a cluster of narrow tunnels snaking beneath the earth, annotated with scribbles that looked like fragments of sentences Elias had never finished. Strange symbols repeated across several pages, 3 interlocked shapes, identical to the carvings found on the wooden tokens. It was impossible to tell whether Elias had designed these maps himself or copied them from something he had found. More unsettling were the burn marks along the bottom edge of the notebook. The charring seemed deliberate, not accidental, and when his uncle held the pages up to the light, faint outlines of erased sketches became visible, shapes resembling figures standing in a circle. One figure appeared smaller than the others. Nearby, Elias had written a single word: mercy. The sheriff dismissed the notebook as the ramblings of a young man who had wandered too far into superstition, but others in town believed it proved Elias had stumbled onto something hidden, something the Brewer siblings had created deep in the mountains. The path labeled the Calling Pit concerned them most. Tracks found near the area matched the trio footprints hunters had spoken of for years, the same eerie steps that suggested 3 people walked together in perfect rhythm. Elias's map seemed to trace that path directly. The final sketch showed a darkened hollow marked with a crosshatched symbol, and beneath it, in handwriting more frantic than the rest, Elias had scrawled a chilling note: "They're not alone down there." The first time the harmonic chant was heard, it was dismissed as wind slipping through the narrow gaps of the mountain hollows, but those who heard it more than once knew it was something else entirely. It began during the third extended search for Elias Turner, when a group of men camped near the ridge above Blackwater Hollow. They had set up tents, built a fire, and agreed to take turns keeping watch. Around midnight, the air grew unnervingly still, the flames shifting downward as if pressed by an invisible weight. Then a sound rose from the trees, soft, distant, and strangely melodic. At first it resembled humming, a single tone carried on the cold air, but soon it split into layers, forming a 3-part harmony so precise it made several men stand upright in shock. The notes were low and drawn out, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt practiced, intentional, almost ceremonial. It was not the voice of one person, nor did it sound like 3 separate individuals joining together. The tones blended so perfectly they seemed to come from a single throat producing multiple sounds at once, something no human could replicate. Some men claimed they recognized words hidden within the chant, though no 2 agreed on what they heard. One insisted he caught the name, mercy, stretched and distorted into something mournful. Another believed the voices repeated a phrase over and over, yet he could never recall it once the sound faded. What all agreed on was the direction. The chant rose from deep within the woods, from the very areas where the Brewer siblings were rumored to have built their hidden life. As the sound swelled, the forest responded. The trees seemed to resonate, the ground vibrated softly beneath their boots, and even the air tasted metallic, like the first moments before a storm. The search party fled the ridge by dawn, refusing to stay another night. But the chant did not end there. Over the following weeks, shepherds, hunters, and woodcutters reported hearing the same eerie harmony at the edges of their routes. It always began faintly, growing louder the longer one listened, as if the source drifted closer with deliberate patience. Animals reacted violently. Dogs cowered under porches, goats refused to graze near the tree-line, and horses bolted at the first trembling notes. A few men swore they heard the chant beneath the earth itself, humming through stone as if originating from an underground cavern. What troubled people most was that the chant always came in threes, 3 tones, 3 harmonies, 3 blended voices weaving together like one entity. Many believed it was the Brewer brothers and their sister performing some strange ritual, but others whispered a darker theory, that whatever lived in those woods had learned to use human voices as bait. Those who heard the chant too long reported an overwhelming urge to walk toward it, even when every instinct screamed to run. It was as though the harmony contained a subtle pull, a beckoning force designed to guide listeners deeper into the mountains where the missing had vanished without a trace. The discovery of the stone circle was the moment when speculation hardened into dread, because for the first time people found something that no amount of superstition or folklore could dismiss. It began with 2 brothers, Caleb and Wright Dobson, who ventured deeper into the mountains than usual while tracking a wounded deer. After following the blood trail through dense brush and over a narrow ridge, they stumbled into a hollow neither recognized. The place felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses against a person's ears until their own breathing sounds too loud. The center of the hollow was marked by a wide, flattened clearing, and in the very middle stood a ring of stones arranged with unsettling precision. The stones were far too heavy for a single person to lift, yet each one sat perfectly aligned, forming a circle almost 20 feet across. Some of the stones bore faint carvings, lines curling into spirals, cross-hatched marks, and the same interlocking 3-part symbol found on the wooden tokens. The shapes were carved so deeply that the grooves were still visible despite years of weathering. The brothers noticed immediately that the snow inside the circle had melted, though the forest around them remained frozen and untouched. Steam rose faintly from the exposed earth, carrying a sour odor like damp iron. Wright approached the stone nearest to him and saw remnants of something smeared across its surface, a dark residue dried into the cracks. He touched it and recoiled, claiming later that it felt warm despite the bitter cold. Surrounding the circle were dozens of footprints arranged in sets of 3, each trio moving in tight, deliberate paths around the stones. They overlapped in ways that suggested repeated use, as if people had circled that formation countless times. The footprints were oddly uniform, spaced with mechanical consistency, showing no hesitation or variation in stride. It was as though the individuals who made them moved in complete synchronization, 3 shadows following one rhythm, one purpose. At the far edge of the clearing, Caleb found what looked like a small altar, a flat slab of stone bearing more carvings, along with a cluster of objects placed with careful intent. Bits of bone, folded scraps of animal hide, and fragments of wood etched with the same disturbing symbols had been arranged around the slab in a geometric pattern neither brother could decipher. Some of the bones appeared bleached, others fresh, as if whatever was happening there hadn't stopped long ago but had been carried out recently. A ring of charred ground extended just beyond the stones, suggesting fires had been lit around the circle, possibly for rituals or gatherings. When the brothers realized the footprints led toward the dense timber on the north side of the hollow, they felt an overwhelming instinct to leave before whoever or whatever created the circle returned. Yet even as they fled, both confessed later that they heard something rising from the earth beneath their feet, a barely audible hum, steady and low, as if the ground itself was singing. It wasn't the harmony heard in other parts of the forest, but a much subtler vibration, one that seeped into their bones and followed them long after they reached safety. It was enough to convince many in Rowan Hollow that the Brewer siblings had built more than a hidden camp or cult. They had constructed a sacred place, a gathering ground, and perhaps even a doorway to something far older than themselves. The night the town finally went searching for the Brewer siblings' hidden settlement marked the moment when fear turned into urgency. After Mercy's brief reappearance, Elias's cryptic map, and the discovery of the stone circle, Rowan Hollow reached a breaking point. Too many people had vanished, too many warnings had gone unheeded, and the chant that drifted through the forest had grown louder each night, echoing closer to homes than ever before. A group of 12 men, hunters, farmers, and a few who simply refused to let terror swallow their town, gathered at first light with rifles, lanterns, and dogs. They followed Elias Turner's map, tracing the path labeled the Calling Pit, though every man felt an instinctive dread as the trees closed around them and the forest grew unnaturally silent. The deeper they went, the more they sensed they were being observed. Shadows shifted too quickly, branches snapped without wind, and the dogs pulled their leashes tight, whining with their tails pressed flat. A mile past the ridge, the first sign appeared, a row of wooden tokens tied across the trail like a warning banner. Beyond them, the air felt thicker, as though stepping into another world. Hours passed before the men reached the ravine marked on Elias's map. At its base lay a narrow path carved into the dirt, descending into a gully where sunlight barely touched. The walls were lined with symbols, scratched, burned, or painted in the same three-part motif. Some marks were fresh enough to glisten. And scattered along the path were remnants of habitation, broken jars, scraps of woven cloth, footprints in sets of 3 going both up and down the ravine. The realization hit the group that the Brewer siblings had not simply survived in the wilderness, they had built something sustained, organized, and active. The dogs began to thrash at their leads as the chant rose from the darkness below, soft at first, then building into a full harmony that vibrated through the ravine walls. Each man felt the sound crawling beneath his ribs, tugging at the edges of his will. The chant was not just heard, it was felt, like a pressure urging them to keep going. When they reached the bottom, they found a clearing lit by dim, flickering lanterns hung in sets of 3. Crude structures built from logs and hides stood in a cluster, forming a tiny settlement that looked both primitive and ritualistic. Fire pits, arranged in triangular patterns, still emitted faint heat. But what froze them was the sight of a larger structure at the center, part cabin, part shrine, built into the hillside itself. Its entrance was adorned with braided vines woven into the interlocking symbol. Around it, footprints spiraled inward as though forming a path used repeatedly for rituals or gatherings. The chant swelled again, this time so close it seemed to rise from the very ground beneath them. Some men shouted, others raised rifles, but the sound drowned everything. In that moment, one truth settled over them with crushing certainty: they were not alone in the ravine. Something was watching from the shadows between the structures, moving with slow, synchronized steps, approaching in trios just as the rumors had always claimed. And whatever the Brewer siblings had become, or whatever they had awakened, was waiting for them in the dark, humming the same haunting harmony that had lured so many before them.